Okay, hopefully this is actually recording. I've had a couple of recording issues lately, but it seems like it's recording, so it should be okay. All right, so this is one of our lectures for Art History 2, specifically in the module on contemporary art. And in this one, we're going to talk predominantly about feminist art, but we're going to talk a little bit about identity art. And those two are connected. Feminist art is one of the forms of identity art. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at this slide. This is by a group of artists called the Guerrilla Girls. So feminist art as a whole, as its kind of goal, brings attention to the societal and the political differences women experience within their lives. That's the basic idea behind it. It's a subset of instrumentalism, which if you think back to the isms lecture, we talked about the 5 kind of big categories of art, instrumentalism being one of them, which is one that means kind of art with an agenda, art that's political, art that's trying to change your mind about something or inform you about something. And the objective of feminist art is to bring positive change and also promote understanding and also to subvert and critique the patriarchy and the way that society is set up, basically. So, historically, let's situate ourselves in about the 1970s. We're going to move around chronologically a little bit, but for now, let's situate ourselves in the 1970s in America, okay, in the United States. So for the moment, we'll situate there. At that time, many artists start kind of investigating the social dynamics of power and the social dynamics of power and privilege, especially in related to things like gender, and also in relation to things like racial, ethnic, and sexual orientation issues that also figured prominently into some of the more socially engaged artwork at this time. So we're talking about the first and second wave feminism, we're talking about the civil rights movement, we're coming right off all the protests against the Vietnam War, so there's a lot of a really engaged, socially conscious kind of public taking up issues, social issues, and that extends into the art world as well. So artists play a significant role in the feminist movement, which is what we're talking about today, and the main goal of the movement was equal rights for women in contemporary society, in their contemporary society at the time. That's still the goal of feminism today, and to focus attention on the subservient place of women in societies throughout history, basically. So also to kind of shine a light on why this movement is happening and what they're upset about, basically. Okay, so that's kind of our context right now. So let's look at this slide. This first slide, this is a poster that was made by an activist group of artists called the Guerrilla Girls. Now the Guerrilla Girls are known for performance art and also for pieces like this. They are an anonymous group of feminist or female identifying artists who are devoted to fighting sexism and also racism within the art world. And what I mean by anonymous is they take the names of famous artists in history. So like if I were a Guerrilla Girl, my name is Megan Rosen, but if I were a Guerrilla Girl, I would take on a name like Artemisia, to be Artemisia Gentileschi as my pseudonym. So they take on names of artists that have previously existed so that they themselves, the real contemporary people, can be anonymous. And when they appear in public and in performances and in protests and things, they wear gorilla masks. So it's kind of a little tongue-in-cheek thing because they spell gorilla like guerrilla warriors, but they're gorillas like they wear like the animal gorilla masks. Okay, so basically they are devoted to fighting sexism and also racism. They tend to be what we would call intersectional feminists, right? They're also interested in issues of racial inequality. And they are formed in New York City in 1985. Okay? They're still active today, and the members rotate throughout the year. So there's a few people who are original members, but they do rotate throughout the years. So, okay, so this is one of their more famous images, and you can buy this as a poster, or you can buy it on like, I think I have it on a kitchen towel. You can buy it on tote bags and things like this. But let's look at what this thing is doing. So this is a piece of artwork. It's an instrumentalist piece of artwork, and it's a political piece of artwork, and it's utilizing just text to get the message across. So even though it's visual art in form. It's predominantly text and doesn't have an image like what we're used to. So let's just read through it. The advantages of being a woman artist. Working without the pressure of success. Not having to be in shows with men. Having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs. Knowing your career might pick up after you're 80 or dead. Being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labeled feminine. Not being stuck in a tenured teaching position. Seeing your ideas live on in the work of others. Having the opportunity to choose between career and motherhood. Not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits. Having more time to work when your mate dumps you for someone younger. Being included in revised versions of art history. Not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius. Getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. So, they also use satire, obviously. They also use sarcasm really heavily and kind of bited tongue-in-cheek sort of feelings. Because obviously, these are all negatives of being a woman artist, right? Like women artists on the whole, and this is starting to change finally, but women artists on the whole make up less than 3% of the collected artworks of all the major museums in the world. Women, for the first time ever, a living woman artist is in the top 10 most wealthy living artists in terms of sales of artwork. That's Yayoi Kusama. We'll talk about her when we talk about installation art. But basically, women tend to be, and historically definitely, do not get as much credit for their work, tend not to become as famous, tend not to be commissioned and collected by museums, tend to be less likely to get a tenure-track professorship position in art departments at universities. That one is changing a lot. So basically all of these things are just saying, here's what women have to overcome if they want to work in the art world. And it's changing some. It has changed significantly since the Guerrilla Girls were first formed in 1985. But some of that changes because of them and because of other women artists, okay? So they do a lot of work like this, where they're doing things that have a little bit of humor, but it's kind of very sarcastic, satirical kinds of humor. Okay, so let's look at some other stuff. Let's back up. Let's go back to the 1970s. So that was from the 80s. Let's go back to the 1970s when feminist art really starts taking off. And that is to say, there's lots of artists that I'm not going to talk about today that could also be considered feminist artists. They were feminists. They made work about concerns of women in different time periods. I mean, going all the way back to Artemisia Gentileschi, who we talked about in the Baroque period, we could consider her a feminist artist. We could definitely, Louise Bourgeois, who we've already talked about in postminimalism, was a feminist artist. There's lots of artists that would fit into this category. But today I'm talking about artists, some of the artists who really specifically were involved in the feminist movement or really identify as feminist or identity art kind of making people. But there's tons of artists that I could talk about. This is a very limited scope. Okay, so let's look at this work. This work is called Womanhouse. And it was a interactive installation that was made and was on display from January 30th to February 28th in 1972. So it was only up for a month. And it's a feminist art installation and performance space that was organized by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro. We're going to talk about both of them quite a bit today. And they were also the co-founders of the Feminist Art Program at CalArts. CalArts is a very famous art program in California, and they co-founded this feminist art program. And so for Womanhouse, they basically found this old, dilapidated, abandoned kind of Victorian-era house in Hollywood in Los Angeles, California. And they figured, and it had been abandoned for years and years, they figured out who owned it, and they contacted the family that owned it, and no one had lived there for like 20 or 30 years or something. And they said, hey, what are you going to do with this house? And they said, well, actually, we're going to have it demolished and sell the land. And they were like, well, can we have it? Can we rent it from you for 1 month and do a feminist art installation and performance piece there? And they agreed. So this was a 1 month long rental of a space to be totally devoted to this art project. And then the building was destroyed after that, so it no longer exists. This is often credited as the first public exhibition of feminist art. So as I said, there have been many artists before that would consider themselves feminists, would consider themselves pro-egalitarianism, pro women's rights, but this is the first major work that was done in the public that was labeled as feminist art. And work for the space was created by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, obviously, but it's also created by their students from the Feminist Art Program at CalArts. And it's also, there was some work and some performances done by other artists from the community that they invited. So let's look at some more images related to this. So this image on the left is most of the artists who worked on the Womanhouse. There are a couple who aren't pictured, but most of them are pictured there. And then we have one of the installations in one of the rooms. So there's all the rooms in this house, and they did installations in all of them, and then they had scripted performances as well. So this was the linen closet. This is made by one of the students in the program, Sandy Orgill. And so she built this female figure into the cupboard, into the ironing space. This was the kitchen of Womanhouse, and it was created by 4 of the students: Susan Frazier, Robin Welch, Rhonda Westcoat, and Vicki Hoggets. And they called it the Nurturant Kitchen. And if you look closely, you'll see all those forms on the ceiling and the walls. Those are breasts, so the idea of women nurturing with their bodies, and also like the woman's place being in the kitchen and serving and nurturing. So they're kind of subverting that idea. There are lots of little detailed things going on here too. If you look closely at some of the implements over on the side, a lot of the things have been rendered non-functional. So like spatulas and different things have holes in the middle of them, so they wouldn't actually work to cook and prepare food. So there's lots of little details in here that kind of subvert this idea of the link between womanhood and domesticity. And there was one room where there was this big crocheted kind of spider net thing happening. There was one room that had a perfect little dollhouse replica of the house inside it. So there were a lot of different things happening in this space, and it was very well regarded. At the time, it was really well received. Over 10,000 people came through the exhibition. They had numerous performances in the space, and it was considered kind of a big deal. So it was kind of the big splash that feminist art as a movement made kind of into the scene. Okay, so let's look more closely at another piece by Judy Chicago. So Judy Chicago is one of the founders of the CalArts Feminist Art Program and also one of the co-curators of Womanhouse. But let's look at another work of hers. So this is one of the masterpieces of feminist art. And as I said, it's by Judy Chicago, and it's called The Dinner Party. It is now part of the permanent collection at the Brooklyn Museum. So if you're ever in New York and you go over to the Brooklyn Museum, which is a wonderful museum, you should definitely check it out. This is on permanent display there, so you can go and see this thing in person. It's gigantic. It's kind of intimidating in person. I have seen it a couple of times, and it's pretty fantastic. So it was created in 1979, and it took Chicago and a team of like 400 people to create this thing. So as I said, this is massive. It's quite large, and it has a lot of really intricate, fiddly details in it. So Judy Chicago describes it to be a reinterpretation of the Last Supper, but this time from the point of view of women who throughout history had prepared the meals and set the table. So here the women are the honored guests. So she originally had this vision of having it be one long table set up kind of like the iconic image of the Last Supper with Christ in the center and the disciples, but instead she was going to have 13 places set and have it be famous historic women. Well, then she decided to change it a little bit, and she decided instead of having one long table, she'd have the table where it has 3 sides. So it's a triangle. The inverted triangle has been a symbol of women throughout history and prehistory. 13 is a significant number because there are traditionally 13 women in a coven, and so there are 39 place settings because there's 13 on each side. So everything is very intentionally done here. And her goal with this was to forge a new kind of art that was expressing women's experiences and also kind of honoring important women and important female voices throughout history that were not recognized in their time. So she wanted to relate women's history through techniques traditionally associated with women's work, things that are kind of relegated to, we talked about this a little bit before, but ideas about craft and what women's work is. So she wanted to kind of reclaim those kind of techniques and elevate them to the fine art or high art realm. So some of those techniques are things like needlework and china painting and ceramics and things like this that had sort of traditionally been sort of written off as this women's work, this craft that's not considered as elevated as painting and sculpture and things like this. So she's subverting that idea and reclaiming this as like, these are fine arts techniques. These are techniques that can be utilized to make high art, to make important work. So this work, let's just physically kind of look at what it is and describe it a little bit. The work itself sits on a triangular white tile floor. So we have these massive tables. They're, I forget, I think they're like 50 feet long, each one of them. So it's huge. And all this three-sided gigantic table is sitting on top of this tiled platform, white tiled platform. And on the white tile are the names of 999 women of achievement throughout history, okay? And this kind of symbolizes, that the achievements of the 39 women, the 13 on each side, are resting upon the work and the achievements of the other women underneath. So the idea is that even though there's only 39 specific place settings, it's acknowledging that there's all these other women who also made huge contributions to culture and history and society. So among the 39, I'm not going to tell you all 39 place settings, but among the 39 place settings all the way around, there's Hatshepsut. That was she was a female pharaoh, so a female pharaoh who led the Egyptians. She's considered one of the most important world leaders of all time in world history. If you take Art History 1 with me, I talk about her kind of a lot. There's also a place setting for the Byzantine Empress Theodora. She's another person who comes up in Art History 1. The painter, Artemisia Gentileschi, has a place setting here, so we talked about her quite a bit in the Baroque. Georgia O'Keeffe, who's in my notes on Depression era art, if you read those, Georgia O'Keeffe is a very famous figure in the art world, and she has a place setting here. Virginia Woolf, the author, has a place setting here. So lots of different women from different periods and different roles in history and different places all around the world are honored at this table. And if you notice, so here in the front down, kind of on the right, the plates are more flat and are just kind of done with china painting. China, like the porcelain china that like teacups are made out of, not China like from China, though that's where the name comes from. That's a different topic. Anyway, so they're just painted in flat. As you progress around the table, so down the side, along the back, and back towards the front here, the plates get more and more three-dimensional. And that is meant to symbolize kind of the rise of women and women rising in their power and in prominence and in their contributions and recognition in society. So that's very intentional. The plates all also have both a butterfly and a vulva motif. The butterfly being a symbol of liberation throughout history, and the vulva being, of course, a symbol of female sexuality. There's a bunch of artists among the 999 women's names on the floor. I won't tell you all of them, but here's some of them. Lavinia Fontana, who one of you wrote about for this class, Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun, Adelaide Labille-Guiard, Angelica Kaufman, Mary Cassatt, Berthe Morisot, Cathay Kolwitz, and Louise Nevelson, who are all artists that we've talked about in this class. So I just like to include them because I think it's kind of a fun kind of throwback to things we've already talked about. So let's think about the individual place settings a little bit more. So each place has identical cutlery, so identical knife, fork, and spoon, and an identical goblet, the thing to drink out of. So those are all identical, and that's kind of to show a uniformity, and these are all women who are contributing and nourishing society in the same kind of way, though they're all from different times. So that's kind of a uniformity of cause and contribution. And then also at each place setting, there's a unique placemat, and table runner, and there's a unique plate. And that's kind of to show the individual contributions and the individual personalities and achievements of each woman. So there's a uniformity in some aspects, and then there's also the uniqueness and individuality of each person. Okay, so I'm not looking at my notes enough, and I'm afraid I'm going to forget to tell you something. So each of the place settings and table runnings is hand embroidered. So this is using needlework, which is again something that's traditionally associated with women's work. And then the plates are all ceramic and handmade ceramic plates that are then hand painted with China painting techniques. Okay, let's back up for just a second because I got so excited and into telling you about this work, I didn't tell you that much about Judy Chicago. So let me tell you about the artist for a minute. So she is born in Chicago in 1939. And her name that she was born with is Judy Cohen. Okay, so she did not want to keep her last name, so for her artist name, she just named herself after the city she was from. That is also has roots in her feminist ideas, and that she didn't want to have her father's name, which she saw as a symbol of the patriarchy, attached to her artistic career, because she felt like that was sort of contradictory to her purpose. So she just named herself Judy Chicago after the city that she is from. So that's why her name is Judy Chicago. She's born in 1939. She's still alive today. She's still making work. She does all kinds of different work. She's extremely famous. I actually got to meet her when I was an undergrad. She came to speak at my college, and I was the student rep that got to go pick her up from the airport, and I got to like go out to dinner with her, and it was kind of incredible. It was like meeting a real iconic legend, and she's a very tiny person. I'm quite tall, but she's a very tiny person, but she's so incredible and so brilliant, and it's really kind of one of the highlights of my life was meeting Judy Chicago, so I feel like I have even more of kind of a personal connection to this. But basically, she has always kind of had the goal of wanting to educate the public about women's role in history and women's contributions to culture and their contributions to the fine arts, and kind of to establish respect for women and their art and their work and their roles in society. And again, she's still alive. She's still making art. I think she's about 90, so she's still kicking it, still doing all the art things. And she was trained, she had her undergraduate degree, and then she got her MFA, her graduate degree, I think at UCLA, so University of California, Los Angeles. But she's a pretty rad lady. You can look her up. She's also a writer. She's very prolific. She's made tons of work and written a lot of articles and things. Here are just some closer images of this, so you can see how much work is in each one of these works. Really pretty incredible things to see in person. Okay, so let's also talk about Miriam Shapiro. She's the other co-founder of the Feminist Art Program at CalArts and the other co-curator of the Womanhouse. So she was born in Toronto in 1923, so she was Canadian. She got her BA and her MFA at the University of Iowa here in the States. And she had a very successful career as a hard edge painter. So we talked about hard edge painting a little bit when we were talking about kind of the later part of abstract expressionism, and also in its relationship to minimalism when I talked about minimalism. So she did large scale abstract paintings that had really clean, almost like machine-made looking edges. She was quite famous for that in California and had a really strong career doing hard edge painting. That was in the 1960s. So then she becomes interested in kind of the hidden metaphors and symbols and Jungian ideas and connections to womanhood that she was seeing in abstract painting, including her own. So she was kind of very formalist, which we've talked about formalism, and you can go back and review the isms lecture if you want to know about that more, and was very interested in kind of this Greenbergian idea of formalism and Greenbergian modernism, which is just like the art is the art, what you see is what you get, just doing abstract painting. But then she started becoming really interested in feminist issues, and in particularly ways to represent womanhood and feminist issues without being super literal. So using abstraction for education and then also exploration of these feminist issues. So when she met Judy Chicago, they get along really well. They co-found the Feminist Art Program at CalArts. They do Womanhouse. And for Womanhouse, Miriam Shapiro's contribution, other than she did some performance work as well, was that she made this tiny little, like, to scale dollhouse, okay? And it was kind of talking about the domestication and sort of infantizing of women in domestic roles. But when she's making it, she sews all these little components, and she starts sewing, which she hadn't done since she was very young. And she becomes super interested in sewing techniques and thinking about that in relation to fine art making. So in the 1970s, because remember Womanhouse is in 1972, she starts making, oops, sorry, I don't know why this just popped up. Hang on. Okay, sorry about that little detour. My computer was trying to update itself. So in the 1970s, she starts making these huge sewn fabric collages, is what she's calling them, and assembling them from a variety of different fabrics that she's getting at rummage sales and things. And she calls them femages. So that's Femmages, femage, and she wrote a little book about femage. This is French. The word femme means woman, and then combining with this idea of collage and kind of subverting the idea that Picasso and Braque sort of invented collage, because women were basically collaging and quilt making and other fiber arts for many, many hundreds of years before that. So this is a slide of 2 panels from a 10-panel composition that she created that was 52 feet long. So this is a gigantic work. And it was called The Anatomy of a Kimono. And it was using kimono patterns to sew these panels. So this is one of her larger works that she did. But she did a lot of work like this, where she's using sewing and these ideas about collage to create these kind of works. She died in 2015, I think, pretty recently, and she was in her 90s. So she was making work up until her death, when she was in her 90s. To connect to this idea, this kind of using fabric collage and using ideas from fashion and from wearable work like kimono, I want to connect to an artist who was doing this before Miriam Shapiro, and that's Jayrrell. And Jayrrell was born in 1935. She did her MFA, her Master's of Fine Arts, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is an extremely famous, reputable school. She is an artist. She's also a fashion designer. And she was very involved with the Black arts movement in the 1960s. But you can see in her work, she's doing kind of similar kinds of things, except her work was generally made to be worn and made for the body. But she is incorporating similar kind of conceptual ideas and this idea of reclaiming women's work and needlework and sewing to talk about feminist identity, female identity, and also Black identity. She was a founding member of Afrocobra, which I'll talk about a little more in identity art in my notes online, and I might record a separate lecture about it as well. So Afrocobra stood for the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, okay? And so that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek name, right? So they're sort of critiquing how they were not included in some of the mainstream art movements at the time because of their race. As a part of the Afrocobra Manifesto, Jayrrell strove to provide positive representation of the African diaspora in her work and also in her writing in this manifesto. The African diaspora, I'm not sure if we've talked about that term yet. So that means people who were displaced against their will, essentially. So people of African descent in America were brought here as slaves. So it's a kind of displacement that there's like a whole movement and culture around this idea of kind of longing for a place that is your heritage, but it was never truly your home, that your ancestors were removed from. So that's this idea of diaspora, which plays a large role in a lot of identity work, particularly identity work for groups of people who have heritages from outside where they currently reside. So she was interested in creating positive representation of the African diaspora in her work, in her clothing, and she wanted to produce garments that inspired pride, energy, and respect in the African American communities. So this work is about reclaiming women's work, making it high art, but also fashion, and also not trying to whitewash African identities and not trying to make things that look commercial by white capitalist American standards, but like really embracing the African American culture, the African diaspora, and making that high energy and making that really the forefront of her work. So she's pretty fantastic, kind of an incredible designer and artist, and has a really prolific body of work. Another artist that I teach this artist in my fiber arts class that I teach, and she's just kind of iconic. She's like a kind of a huge deal in the art world to me. She's sort of one of my heroes, and that's Faith Ringgold. And Faith Ringgold is from Harlem. She was born in 1930, so she grew up kind of immersed in the culture that leads into the Harlem Renaissance. So this is something, she was raised in this really rich artistic kind of community and household. She studied at the City College of New York, and then she was an art teacher in New York public schools for like 20 years, for almost 20 years. In the 1960s, she was very prolific. She produced numerous works that provided really critical, incisive commentary on the realities of racial prejudice in America. She incorporated references to gender inequality as well. So she's one of those artists that does a lot with identity work in both the feminist art movement and also related to the Black arts movement and African American culture. And definitely like political work, trying to raise awareness and get people interested in what's happening to people in different communities. She incorporated these references to gender and inequality, as I said, and she begins in the 1970s, so she was doing paintings originally, but she begins in the 1970s to start using fabric as her primary medium, and she makes these kind of quilts and wall hangings. She wanted to make a more pointed reference to the domestic sphere, and in doing that, subvert a traditional woman's work narrative. So again, we come back to this idea of woman's work, and anything with sewing being kind of relegated to this lower realm, women's work, craft, that kind of thing. And she wants to elevate that back up to high art and fine art and use it to subvert some of these sexist ideas, right? So she created this work, which is called Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima, after her mother died in 1981. And this is a story quilt, which is a long tradition of making story quilts. They don't always have words. A lot of times they're didactic in that they just have images that tell a story, but this one has images and words. And this merges the personal and the political. So she's telling some personal aspects of her story and her mother's story interwoven with these larger kind of themes and tropes that relate on a larger scale than just the personal. So in this story quilt, Aunt Jemima tells a story about the family and about a stereotypical Black mammy, kind of in the mind of the public, this sort of stereotype that Aunt Jemima kind of represents this Black mammy character from culture, right? So she, as this figure, is telling the story, but in Faith Ringgold's version, Aunt Jemima is a successful businesswoman. So she's not this kind of country bumpkiny, uneducated figure that you sometimes see portrayed in these kind of negative stereotypes. Okay, so in this, basically, she's using the storytelling quilt, she's using this women's work kind of sewing technique, and she's taking these mass media kind of cultural negative stereotypes and flipping them and kind of reclaiming them. Another artist who is, again, she's just sort of legendary to me, like Betty Sarr, who's still alive and still making work and is kind of a superwoman. She's incredible. So she's a legend in the contemporary art world. She was born in 1926 in LA. She's from Los Angeles. She still lives in Los Angeles. And she's still making work. She's in her 90s. And our art museum here in Springfield, the Springfield Art Museum, has one of her works in the permanent collection and has, I think, 2, maybe 3 works by her daughter, Allison Sarr, who's also an artist, also in the collection. So always check out the local art museum. And we have a wonderful museum here in town if you haven't been there yet. She's best known for her assemblage work, which is like what this is. But she's also a painter and she's also a printmaker. And she started in printmaking. She went to UCLA and then did graduate studies at the University of California, Long Beach, and at the University of Southern California, and then at the American Film Institute. So she's super educated. She's done lots of different programs, and she is someone who really plays in with feminist work and identity art. She has a mixed ancestry of African American, Native American, and Irish heritage, and she reflects on all of those aspects of her lineage in her work. She considers herself a feminist, but she generally emphasizes the cross-cultural aspects of her work and her interest in reclaiming the Black female body. So a lot of her most famous and what she describes as her most significant work is around this reclamation of the Black female body. This work, this is from 1972, and so this is the same year as Womanhouse, right? So she's in LA also, so they're located in Los Angeles. Womanhouse is happening, and this is what I mean, like it's considered the first public artwork for feminist artwork, but there's other artwork that's definitely feminist that's happening at that time too, just not quite on that kind of interactive scale. Okay, so this is one of her more famous works. And here she wanted to reflect on the Black experience in America. Here she uses the Aunt Jemima trope again. So we're seeing Aunt Jemima in both of these works. And she's using this character to kind of draw out the stereotypes associated with being Black in this country. So we see this figure and she stands on cotton down at the bottom, which that is meant to reference slavery. When Betty Sarr speaks about this work, she talks about the cultural perception that Black women were not good enough, but good enough to serve, which is this like horrible kind of prejudice that exists in American society, and particularly, I mean, still exists today in a lot of ways, but particularly in the 70s when this was made. So her goal here is to confront and subvert that idea, basically. So here the Jemima figure holds a broom in one hand, which is the whole like serving, cleaning, that kind of mammy role. But in the other hand, she has a rifle. And this is kind of a visual representation of resistance. Like this is someone who is not just going to cook and clean and be quiet and do what they're told. This is someone who's going to revolt and stand up for herself, and you know, it's kind of an unexpected twist on this trope. So when she's talking about her work, she says, I used the derogatory image to empower the Black woman by making her a revolutionary, like she was rebelling against her past enslavement. And she wrote this, and she wrote an article for Freeze called Influences that was published in 2016. So it's a fairly recent article with her looking back on these works. And she's interesting. Like I said, she's done painting and printmaking, but she's most known for these assemblages. So this is not a painting. This is an actual racist little figurine that she found. And then she included these images. You'll notice there's a raised fist in the bottom there, which is the symbol of the Black liberation movement. So there's a lot going on here in this work. And that's how all of her work is. It's very impactful. Here's another piece of hers. So this one is more two-dimensional. It's painted, but it's painted on this cupboard door. So there is some, it is partially three-dimensional. She talks about becoming interested in assemblage when she saw the work of Joseph Cornell, who is another modernist sculptor. We haven't talked about him, but if you look up his work, he's known for assemblage. And she thought that that would be a good way to kind of literally take these sort of tools of oppression, these oppressive kind of derogatory tchotchkes, like this figurine and these Aunt Jemima labels in the background. So taking those and repurposing them to kind of subvert and fight against these negative stereotypes. So super fascinating artist, really fantastic, very fantastic writer as well. Okay, Anna Mendiada. Anna Mendiada is a artist that's really hard for me to talk about personally because I get really upset when I think about her. She's no longer alive because she was murdered. So she, so really fantastic, really groundbreaking, really important artist. And she was murdered by her husband, Carl Andre, who's also an artist. He's a minimalist sculptor. He's still alive. He's a garbage person. And he pushed her out of the window of their apartment in New York, and she fell to her death. And she was only like 36. So I get kind of like furious when I think about her because she was so incredible in her brief career and all the groundbreaking stuff that she did, and she should still be alive. And it makes me sad and also full of rage. So, Ana Mendiada. All right, let's talk about her work. So she was born in Havana, Cuba, in 1948, and then she moves to the United States. She dies in 1985 because she's murdered by a garbage human who should not still be a respected artist with work in museums, but he is. Anyway, she studied at the University of Iowa. Like Miriam Shapiro, she did her BA, MA, and MFA there. So she was there for her undergraduate and graduate studies. Interestingly, her graduate school work focused on violence against women, particularly, male violence against women, domestic violence against women. And then that is how she eventually dies. So it's sort of a sad, sort of prophetic kind of work. Gender issues continue to be a major subject of her work throughout her tragically brief career. And she's also interested in ideas related to spirituality and cultural heritage. Her most famous series is this series. So this is one of the works from it. It's called Silueta, which is Spanish for silhouettes. It has around 200 works. So she considered the work itself to be these performances and temporary earthworks that she did using her body and natural materials out in the world. And then she took photographs of them and took films of them. And so those are kind of the documents of the work. But the actual act itself is what she considered the artwork. But she did around 200 of these. And they're earth body works, and they were completed between 1973 and 1980. She described these works as her attempts to carry on a dialogue between the landscape and the female body based on her own silhouette. So this particular one is called Flowers on the Body, and this is a documentation photo of this work. And this is the first earth body sculpture in this series called Silhouettes that she did. So this is the first one in this 200 work long series. This is meant to address both birth and death and the human connection to the earth. So she's carved down under her this kind of womb-like sort of inverted mound, the sort of hole in the ground that's supposed to be sort of like womb-like the earth is encompassing her. That's sort of reminiscent of death, of being buried, but also this idea of birth, of life emerging forward and the flowers coming up on her. And she has a lot of important contributions to art history. Using the body as a site is an important development in the art world and leads to the development of both performance art and site-specific work, as well as some later ideas in social practice art. So she was really revolutionary in her work and doing things way ahead of her time. And filming these kind of earth body works outdoors was also kind of a revolutionary thing. I went to an exhibit of her films that had been remastered when I was living in California at the Berkeley, it's the Berkeley Art Museum and Film Archive, and they had this fantastic exhibition of these newly remastered reels of all these works that she did in the world, and they had them displayed really beautifully in this really immersive way. And I went to a panel discussion of them, and it was just incredible. She was just an incredible artist, and it's sad that she is not still around making work. So here's some more pieces from that series. Okay. I'm trying not to talk too long about each of these people because these are all people I really admire and could talk about for a really long time. So I'm trying to kind of mitigate that a little bit. So moving right along, Carolee Schneemann There are so many works by Carolee Schneemann. A lot of them are really disturbing and also super sexualized. So I picked this one, which is not as much so as the other ones. But if you want to see more of her work, you can look her up. She just died a couple years ago, but she had a very prolific career and made lots and lots of really fantastic work that was very controversial throughout her life. So she's very famous for work with the body as site, specifically work with her body as site, and also a very famous performance artist. I think she just died last year, I think maybe 2 years ago, like in 2019 she died. So she was making work up till the end of her life. She was born in 1939. She has an MFA from, I think, Bard, which is a college in New York, not in New York City, but in kind of upstate New York. She had kind of a lot in common with the Gutai performers. When we looked at the Gutai artists, she was certainly aware of their work and utilized some of those techniques. She described her work as kinetic theater, which I've always liked that just as a phrase. Kinetic meaning, active movement, energy. We'll talk about her more when we talk about performance art, but I like to include her with feminist art too, because I think she was a really groundbreaking artist and was definitely a feminist artist and definitely considered herself a feminist artist. Basically, she radically transformed ideas about performance art by using her body to kind of introduce this feminist dimension to the work. Her most famous work, well, she has a lot of famous works, but her probably most famous work is called Meat Joy. Meat like from the animal, meat like, like beef or chicken. Meat Joy, and it was made in 1964. It was very erotic and revolting. I'm going to read you kind of a long quote by her. So she said of her work, "Environments, happenings, concretions are an extension of my painting constructions, which often have motorized sections. But the steady exploration and repeated viewing, which the eye is required to make with my painting constructions, is reversed in the performance situation, where the spectator is overwhelmed with changing recognitions, carried emotionally by a flux of evocative actions, and led or held by the specified time sequence which marks the direction of a performance in this way. The audience is actually more passive when confronting a still work." So basically she's saying that the performance pieces or video works or anything that has motion that's happening in a time, through the passing of time, by its nature makes the audience involved and more active than the audience looking at something that's still and static. So that is an idea that becomes very popular in the 60s and 70s and leads to performance art and eventually video art as well. So she's a pretty important artist. She does a lot of really interesting kinds of body as sight work and also performance art. This is Jane Quick to See Smith. And she was born in 1940, and she's born at the Flat Rock Reservation in Montana. She's a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Nation in Montana. So she's a Native American artist who is a member of that nation currently. She went to the University of Washington in Seattle to study art, and then she continued studying and got her MFA from the University of New Mexico. She's descended from the Shoshone, Salish, and Cree peoples. And her work, she's an artist that I put in this section because she's a feminist artist, but she's also an artist who really embraces aspects of identity as part of her work and makes political work based on wanting to bring awareness and visibility to Native American artists who she feels have been wildly overlooked in the history of art, and she's not wrong. And she also does some work that relates more to feminist issues. This isn't really one of those works. This is more about her identity as a Native American person. So her heritage and her self-identity are basically the central themes of a lot of her work, most of her mature work as an artist. This is a really large work. It's called Trade, and it's this really complex mixed media work. She calls it her response to the quincentenary non-celebration. So basically that's white America's celebration of the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World. It wasn't a new world in the Native Americans who already lived here. So this is sort of a protest piece against that. And so basically what she does, it sort of reminds me of Rauschenberg. We talked about him in pop art, of his combines, where you have this two-dimensional work that has images and pasted in and also screen printed in and then painted over with this kind of drippy red, so it feels a little bit like blood. And then she has, it's sort of a little like his combines, and it has this other three-dimensional aspect. So these are cheap artifacts, tchotchkes, that use Native American imagery for commercial selling of like team sports things or other kinds of goods. And the idea behind this being called trade is this idea that the Native Americans traded their land away for basically nothing from the American government. And so she's like, is trade still good? You want to trade these things back? Trade us back our land for these kind of false representations that you use to sell merchandise. So it's a very overt political work that centers on identity and ideas about heritage. Okay, I also want to look at photography's role in identity and feminist art, which it does play a pretty strong role. Lots of photographers work in this kind of vein, this kind of theme. Cindy Sherman is probably one of the most, I think, the most famous artist, photographer to be heavily associated with feminist art. She was born in 1954. She originally studied painting in college, but she switched to photography. She's very interested in this idea of the male gaze. So that's a man looking at a woman, basically. This idea of the male gaze and how Western art presents the female beauty for the enjoyment of men is basically the idea behind the male gaze. So that's a primary focus of contemporary feminist theory. Since 1977, she's produced about 80 of these works in this series. These are photographs that she calls untitled film stills, and they explore stereotypical portrayals of women, particularly in film. So I think this series is fascinating because it's very postmodern in its concept. So untitled film still. So this is a work that is representing itself as a still, like a still frame from a movie reel, but the film doesn't exist. It's a photograph. So it's creating a fiction that this is an artifact of. And an artifact is meant to be something that proves the existence of something. So it's this weird kind of postmodern idea of simulacra, but it isn't actually imitating something that exists, if that makes sense. So it's this really kind of, when you really think about it, it's kind of a fascinating idea. So she's done around 80 of these. And in each of them, she uses herself as her model, and she dresses up and poses in the form of a stereotypical female role. So this is a kind of housewife figure. There's one where she's like a femme fatale. So all these sort of stereotypical portrayals of women, and she's just sort of taking that back and reclaiming it and making this thing that's of her own, because the reference that it's critiquing doesn't actually exist. Okay, so that's Cindy Sherman. Another photographer that's really important to feminist art and identity art is Carrie Mae Weems. She's a photographer and a contemporary feminist artist who she addressed the racial and the social concerns of African American women, as is the next artist. The next artist that we'll look at is Lorna Simpson, and she also has some similarities, some overlap in the kind of work that she is famous for. Weems, this artist, was born in 1953 in Oregon. She studied at the University of California, San Diego for her MFA, and she now lives in Syracuse, New York, and is still making work. This is a piece from her Kitchen Table series. So this is a series of 20 photographs, and it's not just photographs. When it's shown in a gallery or a museum, it's 20 photographs, but There's also these text components, and there's also recorded audio. So there's audio, there's sound playing in the gallery when you're looking at these photos. So it's this kind of interwoven experience. In these, the viewer is always positioned at one end of the table. So you're kind of, as the audience member, at one end of the table. Carrie Mae Weems is at the other end of the table, and sometimes there's another figure sitting at the table between the two of you, like in this instance. But the way it's set and the level, it really kind of feels like you're part of the scene, like you're sitting at the table with her. So in this one, we have that kind of setup where we're sort of at one end of the table, she's at the other. We have this male figure sitting there, they're drinking and smoking and playing cards. And then on the wall behind her, we see a photograph of Malcolm X. We also see some photos of her family and some other photos and snippets from articles about the civil rights movement. And here's Weems talking about her own work. She says, "I'm not simply describing African American culture. I'm really involved with other levels of description that move across several different kinds of categories. On the one hand, I might be interested in what's happening in gender with men and women, with black and white, and Asian people. And maybe I'm also interested in a question of globalization and class." So she's an artist who addresses a lot of different issues in her work, but she's really known for these kind of black and white photos and interweaving them with writing and audio, and also this kind of domestic settings, like around the kitchen table. These are the sort of works that she is quite well known for. This is a work by Lorna Simpson. Lorna Simpson was born in 1960. She became very famous in the 1980s and 1990s. She's known basically for conceptual photography, so a photographer who has really high concept thought processes and ideas behind her work. She does photography. She also does multimedia work. She also has recently started doing more work with film. Her work engages questions about representation, how people are represented, particularly how African American people are represented, particularly how women are represented. She's also interested in ideas of identity, gender, race, and history. And she explores art related to all of these themes in relation to memory through photography and film. So her work also has a lot of nostalgia and memory kind of referential images in it. So it's very complicated work, and she executes it really well. She did her MFA at the University of California, San Diego, same as Carrie Mae Weems, actually. She's based in Brooklyn, New York, and she's kind of most known for these works that explore Black female identity. That's one of the explorations that she's most known for, but she does a lot of different kinds of work. So I'm sorry, I've been talking for like an hour. I'm trying to sum this up, but Lorna Simpson, very important feminist artist. Okay, I'm going to end with this piece. This is Barbara Kruger. So in the 1970s, we have a lot of feminist artists who are using their art to explore the male gaze. We talked about that a little with Cindy Sherman. And basically, the culturally constructed notion of gender and ideas about gender and ideas about how it's represented and how it's kind of weaponized, almost used to sell people things and used to hold people down and things like this. So Barbara Kruger is born in 1945. She does her MFA at Parsons School of Design in New York, where she studies under Deanne Arbus, who is not someone we've talked about in this class, but is a very, very important and famous photographer. So Kruger also examines feminist ideas in her work, and she utilizes strategies and techniques from mass media. So this is a little different than anyone we've looked at so far, but she takes these ideas from and strategies from mass media and advertising and uses them in her work, and often combines text and photography, as she's doing here. So she was a commercial graphic designer for many years, and then eventually she becomes the art director of Mademoiselle magazine in the 1960s. So Mademoiselle magazine, I'm not sure if it's still a magazine. I feel like it might be. It's sort of like Vogue, sort of like Cosmo kind of thing, very targeted towards women. So she's very keenly aware of how these kind of advertising techniques work. So in her artwork like this, she utilizes layout techniques that magazines and billboard designers use to sell consumer goods. So she's using this language of advertising and of commercial kind of design work, but she's taking it and subverting it and using it for a different kind of messaging. Her goal, Kruger's goal, is to kind of subvert the typical use of advertising imagery. And her aim is kind of to expose the deceptiveness of media messages that consumers sort of complacently absorb every day. Like, we see this stuff every day, and it's influencing us and influencing how we feel about our bodies and what we think we should look like and how we think we should present ourselves and what we think we should buy and consume. And so she's very interested in all of those ideas, but in utilizing those kind of tools to send feminist messages back to the people through her artwork. These things are gigantic. I've seen several of them in person. They're large format. They're like, this one's like 4 feet by 6 feet. And they're text and photograph collages. So this is probably her most famous one. It's from 1989. But they're kind of disturbing. Like, they draw you in and they kind of have a familiar sort of advertising language to them. And then you start looking at them and thinking about the text in juxtaposition with the image, and they're a little bit disturbing, and they're supposed to be a little bit disturbing and make you kind of think. So, using kind of simple techniques to get a complicated message across. All right, I'm going to stop there. There's a million different artists that I could talk about in feminist and identity art, but I will stop there, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.